QSO Today, episode 480, Caryn Eve Murray, KD2GUT. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOToday.com webpage. Sadly, there were no new listener sponsors or donations this week. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Caryn Eve Murray, KD2GUT, while inspired at a young age to ham radio, it wasn't until after a successful career as a professional writer and journalist that she rediscovered amateur radio in 2014. Her ham radio history was pretty thoroughly covered in a recent Ham Radio Workbench podcast a few weeks ago. Our conversation explored her professional history, leading to her reporting for Ham Radio Newsline and her love for CW. KD2GUT is my QSO Today. KD2GUT, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Caryn?
I am. This is KD2GUT. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Caryn. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Let's start at the beginning. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in the metropolitan New York area in Nassau County, in a place called Westbury. And I lived there for the first 17 years of my life, and then went off to college. And there I stayed in the Washington, D.C. area for a couple of years, returned back to the New York area because of something called unemployment. A college degree does not guarantee you a job, and that was lesson number one after getting the diploma.
So for people who don't know the New York area could be the tip of Long Island, or it could be the Jersey side. So Nassau County is where?
Nassau County is the western county of the two counties on Long Island. It is about 40 minutes east of New York City. It's not where I live presently, but that is where I grew up. And we were direct line of sight up in the sky for Kennedy Airport. For anybody who's ever flown into Kennedy, one of the great thrills when I was growing up was jumping out of the car on the driveway just in time to see the SST fly overhead, looking like a giant insect. That was, of course, before that plane was grounded. But my God, that thing made quite an impression in the sky going overhead.
So you're on the approach and the departure for Kennedy? I mean, was it minute after minute air traffic coming over?
Thankfully, not that bad. We did see planes come and go on occasion, but I never paid attention to those, just the SST, because you could not ignore that thing. I mean, you would think you were being invaded by a giant insect, and it was already flying at a fairly low altitude.
And it flew for years. Weren't its first flights mid-60s? So it might have flown for 40 years?
My recollection on that is not that great. I believe I was already driving a car by then, so it may have been the early 70s. Yeah.
Do you have siblings?
I do. I have an older brother. He is 4.5 years older. He was actually my gateway to amateur radio, although I did not open that gate until many, many years later. He and his friends would get on the air from his room, and there was a flashing sign above the door to his room that said "on the air." And whenever he keyed his mic, the sign would flash, and he and his friends would be in there, and the door would be closed to me.
What was his call sign?
WB2UJB. Whiskey Bravo 2 Uniform Juliet Bravo.
Is he still on the air?
Yes. Well, he was off the air. You know the story. I would say 80 to 90% of amateur radio operators have that period of time where they stray from amateur radio and come back. And his license did lapse for a long time, college and work. So some years ago, he decided to get his license back. And it was that year that I thought, at age 12, I looked at the fun those guys were having, and I wanted to be a novice. And I studied CW, which was required then. I didn't master it. I didn't really get too deep into it, but I began to learn it for my test, which I think was then 5 words a minute. And I studied electronics theory, which you had to study also to get your novice. And I didn't follow through on that because something distracted me. Horses. We'll get to that later. I said, I'm a 12-year-old girl. What am I doing? Reading a book on electronics theory. I'd rather ride a horse. So I kind of dropped everything and went with that. But what happened was the year that my brother decided that he wanted to get his license back, get on the air, and get the station of his dreams, I said, it's been a while since I've been 12 and wanting that novice. Maybe I ought to do this too. Something else convinced me the time was right too. We had in the East Coast here of the United States, we had Superstorm Sandy, where power and everything else was knocked out for days and days and days. Here at our QTH, it was out for 14 days. It occurred to me, if I'd had that, I would have had communication. So I went and studied that summer. It'll be 10 years, 2024. I'll be a ham for 10 years. And I got my license. I got my tech. And I got that at the Great South Bay Amateur Radio Club, which I ultimately joined. And the guys said to me, well, congratulations. Now we're going to make fun of you until you upgrade. So I went home. I said, ha. And I studied and I got my general, which is the level of my license right now. Happy with it. No time right now to study for the extra. So I'll be a general, I think, for the foreseeable future.
Normally, I would ask hams at this point how old they were when they got their license, but that was because I was thinking that they were 12. So I won't ask you how old you were when you got your license, because I'm told I'm not supposed to ask, not by you, but in general. But let's go back to 12 years old, if you don't mind, because I don't want to skip over the other story, and that is you were distracted by horses. Was that just a childhood distraction, or did that become something that perhaps kind of set the tone for the rest of your life?
Like ham radio, I was absorbed in it for a while. I took lessons. And like every other female of a certain age, coveted one of those equines, which of course is off limits when you are a student and having to do other things that kids do. So I rode on the weekends. That continued a little bit into college, not too much. I was fortunate. The school I went to in Maryland had horses on the property.
A reason for choosing it?
Not at all. No, not at all. Just it looked like a school that I would enjoy going to. It was in the Washington, D.C. area. It was University of Maryland College Park, the former agricultural school. So they had horses, they had cows, they had their own ice cream factory. Some might choose a school.
That sounds great.
Some might choose a school for that. You never know. But yeah, I rode there. But for the most part, through my late teens into adulthood, I did not ride. I liked horses, but it wasn't something that I wanted to do until a friend made trouble for me some years ago and said, "Oh, I'm thinking of buying a horse, and I'm going on a shopping trip up in Vermont. It's a riding sort of weekend. You want to come with me?" And I said, "Well, great. I haven't ridden in 30 years. That's going to go over big." So I said, maybe I need to take some lessons, at least to prepare for the trip.
Are you an English-style rider or a Western-style rider?
English. I've only ridden English, except, of course, on vacation trail rides, which are always Western, because that's easier to stay on the right side of the horse when you have a Western saddle.
Because there's a horn on the saddle?
People think that's what it's for. They think it's an airbag or a seat belt.
A handle to hold on to?
Exactly. I mean, if horses were born with a horn built in that position, I guess that would make them safer. But yeah, people like the Western saddle. It's also a deeper seat. You actually sit more deeply into the saddle, so you stay on there more easily.
Were you a competitor as a teenager?
As a teenager, I was in a couple of shows because that's what the instructors like the kids to do. I'm not an athlete, and so this was the only thing I could do without looking stupid. And it was fun. It was schooling shows mainly, which are not official shows. They're just little shows that your particular barn puts on, and I enjoyed that. But most of the appeal for me was just enjoying the horse and enjoying the horse's company.
Is mucking the stall part of the enjoying the company?
It is fabulous because the horse looks at you when you're mucking and says, "I got more," where that came from. So yeah, they are never-ending sources of amusement where that's concerned. And I guess I should fast forward to explain why I know that so well. Ultimately, I did 8 years ago get a horse, and the mucking is a very fresh and new experience for me every time I go there to take care of him, because he watches. Yeah, you missed a spot, you know.
The only reason I know this is that one of my sons took English riding lessons for a while. He was not much of a sportsman, but he was an animal lover. That seemed to be very important to him, and so that's why I know about some of these things like mucking the stall. Why did you choose the University of Maryland, and what did you major in?
University of Maryland seemed to be close enough to the New York area, close enough to home, because I started college a little young, and so going too far away really wasn't an option. And I majored in what was then called Arts and Humanities. They reorganized the curriculum there. So I was an Arts and Humanities major with an emphasis in radio, TV, film, and English. I was supposed to be a double major. I was ambitious about that. And 1 or 2 semesters into it, decided I was killing myself. So I would drop English to a minor because I wanted to get out a year early. I'm not sure why. I mean, unemployment was waiting for me either way. 3 years, 4 years doesn't make a difference. You know, you're still sitting around eating ice cream sandwiches out of the freezer, wondering why no one's hiring you. So I don't know what the rush was. I think that's probably my one regret. I don't have too many regrets, but my one regret is that I rushed college. I really should have stayed and had more fun.
It's possible, Caryn, that I stayed too long. After 7 years, my fiance said, "If you want to marry me, you've got to choose a major and graduate."
Yes. See?
I tell people that was before the internet, and the University of California at Santa Barbara had 1 million volumes in their library, and a reader's guide, and every magazine subscription in the world. So It was like if you wanted to deep dive on any subject that caught your whim, you could spend the entire day in the library. I was very happy to do it. So you thought with an arts and humanities major that you would become an educated person. And did that work out for you? Did you become an educated person, even though you mentioned that perhaps you might be unemployable?
I became a college graduate. I don't know that that translates to being an educated person, but I did become a college graduate. I think the best education you get is out in the world. I think most of the things I've learned that are worthwhile and lasting are the things you learn every day when you get out of bed and begin your life again. But college was great because it gave a framework for problem solving.
Taught you how to write.
No, not really.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting.
No, I didn't. The only writing classes I took poetry. I took poetry. I took my first year in college. I there was a poetry class I was desperate to take. And it's amazing when you're young and stupid and you don't realize there are things you're not supposed to do. You just go ahead and do them. And I went up to the professor of that class. I said, I want to be in your class. He says, we're a fourth level class. We're a senior level class. I said, well, I'm a freshman. He says, you're going to have to wait. I said, can I ask a favor? He said, what? I said, can I be in your class anyway? And if I can't keep up with, you can throw me out, okay? I really want to take your class and I don't want to wait a couple of years to take it. I don't know, he was a nice guy, so he let me take it and I got to stay in. And by the way, he and I became the best of friends, which our friendship extended well past my graduation. I'll always be grateful.
And what was the subject?
It was a workshop. It was a poetry writing workshop. It was poetry writing, one of those workshops where you put on a black beret and you drink espresso and you stand in front of the class and everybody goes, yeah, man, that's cool. Wow, that's heavy. That's deep. So we did that. It was just wonderful. I got to meet some very talented people. I mean, you cannot earn a living as a poet. And I remember when I contacted him after I finally got a job, my very first job as a writer at a newspaper, and I was so proud. And I wrote him and I told him what I was doing, expecting him to heap all this praise upon me. And he goes, you're selling yourself. That's so cheap.
That's so funny. Well, this is where you kind of snap back into the real world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Because unfortunately, you actually have to pay rent.
Yes.
You have to eat. My doctor tells me I have to eat.
You have to eat at least every couple of days. Yeah.
So you've graduated and you took a job at a newspaper. Was that your first job out?
No, I graduated, and like I said, nobody would hire me. I wanted to be an advertising copywriter. I had done that. Actually, my ambition in life was to be a TV comedy writer.
Really?
Yes, that's really what I want. I tell everybody, I will do this. I will be a comedy writer or I'll do advertising copy. The last thing I want to do is work for a newspaper. And that was true. I'm not making that up. I would have bet all the money I had on the fact that I would never work for a newspaper. I had no interest in journalism whatsoever.
Well, you were in the center. Maybe you weren't in the center of, I think television comedy writing was in Los Angeles. Wasn't that the kind of the hub?
Mm-hmm.
But there was certainly a lot of comedy being written on the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Did you actually apply for jobs, and what was the response?
Well, my role model, my hero, my idol is Mel Brooks. And I wanted to be him, but he was already Mel Brooks. And I didn't really like the hairline. I just sort of felt like I enjoyed having more hair on top of my head. But he was my role model. in college, my senior thesis was a satire of Great Expectations, done the way Mel Brooks had done he had done Young Frankenstein. And I just felt I could tackle Charles Dickens in much the same way. And so I wrote Great Expectancies, which was about Miss Havisham, one of the central characters in the novel, and she was pregnant forever. She was just pregnant forever. So that was, I forget the exact plot, but it got, I'll tell you, it did get so far as a courtesy reading at MGM, which still amazes me. This is the script of somebody who was maybe 19 or 20 years old. It was my senior thesis, and it got strictly a courtesy reading. It certainly was not fit for production. And the feedback I got from the folks, very generous, kind people, was invaluable to me. It told me mainly that they thought the script was funny, which, hey, I'm good with that. If you tell me it's funny, I can ride on that for years, because I want it to be funny. But it wasn't visual enough. That most of the humor was, it plays with your mind. It's not visual stuff that you see on the screen. And honestly, they were right. And it kind of reaffirmed for me so many years later, if your mindset is geared more toward radio than TV, you're not going to go for the visual humor. You're going to go for the stuff that tickles the brain.
Like Gene Shepard, perhaps.
Yes, exactly.
Theater of the mind. Obviously, with Young Frankenstein, Walk This Way.
Yes.
That's very visual.
Mm-hmm.
There's other ones I would say, but maybe they're not appropriate for the QSO Today podcast. But Young Frankenstein was one of Mel Brooks's most brilliant, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I laugh just thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think I know which one you're referring to, but yes.
They were all great. I wore black the year that Madeline Kahn died. I was madly in love with Madeline Kahn. So,
yeah.
But who wasn't, right?
He handpicked his cast. They were real repertory, and I think they moved as one. The actors contributed to the script. It was really a dynamic experience to create those movies, and he was pretty open to it. I think Mel Brooks, the people, other than a few fights he had with Gene Wilder, which ended well, I think most of his arguments were with the studio. Censorship.
Could he do Blazing Saddles today? Again, it was one of the most brilliant comedies put on film.
Absolutely, and without getting too deep in the weeds on that issue, I just want to say what a shame he couldn't do it today. I think we all need to laugh more and be a little.
Well, it's funny. Those movies, Dracula, Dead and Loving It.
Mm-hmm.
I took the whole family, and my wife left the theater because me and my two sons were howling. It was so funny. With Dracula, Dead and Loving It, you had to watch the Francis Ford Coppola the year before. He did the thing with Gary Oldman, Dracula. So there were a lot of sight gags that he did in that Mel Brooks stole for Dracula, Dead and Loving It. So you saw how ridiculous the Oldman movie was and how absolutely brilliant the Mel Brooks movie was.
Yeah, and genius is what did they say? Genius is in knowing who to borrow from.
And now this mid-show break. The future of podcasting and the QSO Today podcast is listener sponsorship. It keeps us lean and focused on providing you the best ham radio interviews since 2014. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel.io networking lounges all of the time and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A and additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. So what happened? You get your script back, someone read it, you're funny. Why didn't you keep doing it?
I'm not sure. I did briefly even take a class at, I think it was the New School for in Manhattan for stand-up. Why didn't I do it? I think I'm basically a behind-the-scenes kind of person. It takes a lot for me to get out there. And I think it would have taken too much out of me to pursue that path. And there's probably a piece of me that knew that I need consistency and a routine every day. Living on the edge of hysteria is fun in your teens, but I don't know that sits well as you enter adulthood.
So you still have to eat, and there was this serious side of you. Did you have some influence from your family as well to kind of maintain that serious side?
No, they kind of let me do what I wanted. I'm grateful. They always showed support. I think they, foolishly or not, thought I had good judgment. I don't know why. But I'm pretty happy with that. I think they were my biggest fans. My dad certainly encouraged me to be silly. He was very silly. My mom encouraged me to have practical skills and to always have those. She pretty much compelled me to take typing and compelled me to take Greg shorthand, for anybody who remembers shorthand. I said to her, "Oh, you're making me do this because you think I'll only be a secretary like you." And she said, you will always need these skills no matter what you do. I'm sorry I gave her a hard time about that. I did, of course, take the classes because she was paying for them anyway. And I did well. I'm sorry I gave her a hard time because eventually typing and shorthand became something I needed in college when I could write down the entire lectures in my classes and transcribe them later. And certainly as a newspaper reporter in New York City, that became invaluable for two reasons. Reason number one, I could quote people accurately while maintaining eye contact. And best of all, if they looked at my notebook, they had no clue what I was writing down because it just looked like a bunch of squiggles to them.
You had to take a real job, and so you took a real job as a newspaper reporter. Were you a private stringer, or did you actually work for one of the newspapers?
Well, remember, Eric, I have had no news background. When I left college, when I graduated, all I had done were some radio commercials. I had worked for a radio station for a while, writing and producing commercials for them. I was their copywriter. And at first I was unpaid because I told them I just wanted to work for them. And they said, well, we're not hiring. And I said, I didn't say you had to pay me. I just want to work for you. And they ended up hiring me, which was a gift, because their full-time copywriter left, and there I was. So that really worked out beautifully. But again, as you say, you have to eat, and radio, small market radio, does not pay well. So from there, I fulfilled my worst nightmare. Are you ready for this? My worst nightmare. And I became a secretary. A secretary. The very thing I said to my mother, you think I'm just going to become a secretary? Well, I became a secretary.
And your mother never said anything about it?
Never. Isn't that nice? Isn't that nice?
My guess is your mother was the same generation as my mother.
Yeah.
And they were very classy about not rubbing it in.
Did not rub it in. And she could have. And she was very good at that. But she did not.
Where were you a secretary at?
Ready for this? I was going to say, I can see you. You're sitting down, so I don't have to say, are you sitting down? A newspaper. How about that? I worked at a newspaper, which is fine. I didn't want to.
But you can't say which one?
It was then called the Long Island newspaper. It was Newsday, based in Garden City, New York. And at that time, one of the top 10 papers in the country.
Was that an afternoon paper or evening paper?
When I was growing up, I grew up reading it. It was an afternoon paper. It did eventually become a morning paper.
Got to the big time.
Yeah.
When I grew up, that was also, the afternoon papers were kind of the wanting to be the morning papers.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And I cursed under my breath. When you're young, you don't see the direction your life is taking. When you're young, you don't see that there's a bigger picture. You just see that you're a secretary, you have a college degree, and you're miserable. And you go home and you eat ice cream sandwiches out of the freezer. And I did a lot of that. So I made friends there. They thought I was funny. Imagine that. They liked me. And they let me write for their in-house newsletter, the employee newsletter. I said, I want to write for you guys. Can I at least write for your in-house newsletter? I'll interview employees about interesting things they're doing. And I did that. Then I started doing book reviews freelance for the newspaper. I was secretary to the national desk in the late afternoon and into the evening. I was secretary to the 3 managing editors and the executive editor. I was a good secretary. I would hire myself. I was very good. I could type fast. I could take shorthand. I didn't like getting coffee for people because I figured they could get their own coffee. I had a little bit of attitude, but I was pleasant and I did my job. But I was miserable because the words I was writing were someone else's words. As a secretary, you are a scribe. You're not a writer. And I was frustrated. I was running out of ice cream sandwiches. And so one night I went into the managing editor's office. He had called me in and he was ready to dictate a memo. And he looks up at me and he says, "Why do you have that miserable look on your face?" And I said, "It's because I'm miserable." And he said, "And why are you miserable?" And I said, "Because I'm a secretary and that's not what I want to be." He says, "Okay, sit down, listen to me." He says, "We can't do anything to help you, but we have it's like a farm team. There are certain papers that hire from other places." He says, we know they're hiring up at the Middletown Times Herald Record. There's a paper up in the Hudson Valley of New York. They need people. Why don't you try out there? And if they like you, you can go with our blessings. We'd be happy for you. And like I said, I've been very lucky along the way. I think I could not have had the career I've had without these people. These are good people. So I went up to the Hudson Valley and I did my 1-week tryout. And they offered me a job at the end of that week as a copy editor on the news desk. Well, again, keep in mind I was in my early 20s, so no filters. No filters. And I said, "Well, I don't really have a news background. I don't really like news. And listen to this. I mean, I couldn't do this now. I don't really like news. Don't you have anything like in features and lifestyles?" And they said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, we do. Would you like to work for features and lifestyles?" I would love to. "And as long as you're hiring me as a copy editor, can I write for you also?" And they said, "You can do whatever you want." So I took the job, went back, gave notice at Newsday, where I was secretary. They sent me off with a really high-class party, lots of good wishes, a fake front page, making me, the story of the day. That's a newspaper tradition. You always give a front page to somebody who's leaving. And off I went to spend 3 years in Middletown, New York, as a editor and writer. And it was a wonderful experience. And Newsday called me 2 years into it and asked if I would come back and would I try out on the copy desk as a copy editor. And so I said, sure. And I came back. It would have probably doubled my salary, but I was bored. And I turned the job down. And that's crazy, I know, but I sort of knew myself. And I said to them, "Listen, guys, I appreciate that you've kept in touch with me. But if I took this job purely for the money, I think you'd be getting a very unhappy person. I think I have a lot more to learn before I come back here." And I stayed up there. And they called me a second time, I think about 6 months later. And I said, I just is not the right time. I don't feel like I have my footing yet. I mean, I'm on the farm team now, and you're calling me back to the big leagues, and I'm just not ready. I just don't feel I'm ready. A year later, they called me again. They said, "This is the last time. We're starting an edition in New York City. We need reporters. Would you like to come down and talk to us?" And this scared me. This terrified me. Because again, remember, I never took journalism. I have no news background. And not only am I being offered a job as a news reporter, it's in New York City. I mean, look at the papers you have there. You're asking me to join a team of veteran reporters. I was 24 years old, but they did it because they liked me and I was a hard worker. And they told me later that's the only reason. Because they liked me and they knew I'd work hard. So to go back to your earlier question, Eric, did I leave college educated? Yeah, perhaps I did. Perhaps I did to some degree, but my real education began when I came back to New York City and worked as a reporter and got really black and blue and bruised learning. I mean, you don't learn in a better classroom than New York City.
What were you writing about in New York City? Obviously, New York City is a universe of things that you could write about.
Yeah, well, in general, reporters begin doing general assignment, what I call crash and burn stuff. So, shootings, police blotter, hostage situations with armed hostage takers. You have building collapses, fires, riots, politics, the most violent thing of all, politics.
Aren't those the primo positions? You would think that that would be what the stars would want, because if it bleeds, it leads.
If it bleeds, it leads. Well, there's enough to go around in New York City, that's for sure. So everybody gets to do a little bit of that. Yeah. Um, um, Eventually, I covered the state legislature. Eventually, I got assigned to cover Mayor Ed Koch, based at City Hall. I was apprenticed to a lot of good people in the beginning. Everybody was very kind. And we had our stars, but the stars here were usually the columnists. They really were we had brilliant minds. Murray Kempton, who I felt was probably should have been a Greek philosopher, but he was born too late. He even looked like a Greek sculpture. He was an older man with chiseled features and a brilliant way of writing. I was in federal court covering a organized crime trial for the paper one season, and Murray was in there, seated a few benches away. Murray was already a much older man at the time, and I was covering it for the news, for the news, story, and Murray was there as the columnist. And I looked over at him. Murray was slumped over, his eyes were closed, and he was fast asleep. This was very common with Murray. He would do that. And the next day he wrote the most brilliant column. And I thought to myself, that man does better work when he sleeps than most of us do when we're awake. You get to that point when you talk about somebody with a superstar talent. That was Murray Kempton. I'm happy to say I worked with or near the best of the best. And what that does is it drives you and inspires you to be the best you can be. Not in a competitive sense, but just because you're exposed to what human potential can be. And you want to realize what you can do in your life.
Now, if we were going to obviously there's a lot of years between the Koch administration and the point at which you re-entered amateur radio. But did you have a number of different kinds of careers after that, or did you actually stay in journalism?
I got into journalism from the writing and editing standpoint in 1976 and stayed in it until 2019. My long run was with the city edition called New York Newsday, which was closed by Times Mirror, which owned it at the time, and many of us were sent out to the suburban edition. So I stayed on with the suburban edition. I became a business writer. I became a small business columnist, and then eventually a copy editor on the features, and then the news desk. And I also wrote a Sunday column, Sunday feature column for the Sunday, what was then the Sunday magazine. I've had a lot of incarnations there. It's kept things interesting.
You've done something very interesting to me, because before we started, I asked you if you had been a journalist all the way up to the point of going to Newsline. And you said that you weren't a journalist. So somehow you see yourself not as a journalist even though you were writing for newspapers. Is there a difference in terms of the way that you're defining what a journalist is?
Yeah, I think so. I think if in the strictest sense, I could fill out a form, a survey form, and ask occupation, and I would write journalist. I probably write writer, I think, more than journalist. I think of journalist as somebody who knows they want to write for a newspaper and is focused on news. My problem is that I like comedy writing. I've written commercials. Journalism and commercials are on the opposite ends of the spectrum, and I've written ad copy and produced radio commercials. So can a journalist do that? Well, the lines are more blurred now in 2023, but back then one did not touch the other. They were in separate rooms. So my thought is I'm more a writer than a journalist. But because of my years in the newspaper business, I've learned journalism. I practiced journalism. My heart and soul is just in writing. I mean, think back to what my former college professor said when he heard that I was working for a newspaper. You would think he expected, let's just say the word he used conjured images of me standing under a red light on a street corner. And he did use a word. I said to him, I have to eat. I have to eat. It's still writing. I basically said to him, just because it's prose doesn't mean it cannot have elements of poetry. You're not going to do that for a crime scene story, but certainly you're going to do it for a feature story. Words are words. Every word.
I read newspapers today. It seems that every reporter wants to be a columnist. I see a lot of editorial on every page but the editorial page where the big columnists get to put their stuff. But I don't see that journalists today follow the traditional path of journalists at the time that you entered the business.
No.
The writing that you learn to do is so invaluable. Are you applying those same skills to, say, Amateur Radio Newsline?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I wanted to make that point. I don't feel comfortable criticizing where journalism is going now, but I'll just say this, and you can draw a conclusion from that. I left the business in 2019. The newspaper had a buyout, which I had been waiting for forever, and happily took it and moved on to the rest of my life. And I'm very glad. And let me say up front, I'm very grateful for all the years I had and every single person who helped me. So I have only the best and happiest memories of all those years. And that is what I bring to Newsline. Not what you hear and see presently, which is different. For better or worse, it's different. We don't get into the he said, she said of the story. In other words, we don't get into personal disputes. We don't get into nuance. We don't get into rumor. And we do not get into politics, nor does amateur radio, nor should amateur radio. So Newsline is a blend of, I hope, old school journalism and traditional amateur radio ethics. And that's what I hope every week people hear, along with some funny stuff. Hey, I get to do comedy writing too sometimes. I really do, because the showpiece of our newscast is the kicker. It's the end piece, and we've had some real fun with that. And you can have fun. You can do the news and have fun. But I think when it comes down to the serious stuff, you have to realize you are responsible for telling people what they either need to know or want to know. You have to do it responsibly. You can't take one person's word for it. You have to check your facts. You have to check their facts. And you have to be sure that when the newscast goes out, the world is hearing what they should be hearing correctly, without bias. And we hope without error, and certainly without malice, and most definitely without agenda.
Probably most of the papers I see, if you want to get details, it's impossible from the papers. Every column on the front page is somebody's native ad or commentary or editorial or their viewpoint, and all you want to know is what's happening.
Right.
I credit my history degree as, one, I'm able to write, and two, I'm able to dig. Because you had to dig, and you had professors that were telling you, well, where's your primary sources? Nobody is going after primary sources anymore, except maybe Newsline. That's what I appreciate so much about Newsline on the one hand, but this is what I'm not appreciating about most of the media that I'm seeing these days, is because it has an agenda, and it's being purchased by whoever is paying the bills, the advertising bills. I feel like, what a waste. It would be nice to have a paper on the breakfast table that actually had some news in it.
Eric, I think you're calling it the way it is. I think there are a lot of people who hear what you're saying and would be nodding their head in agreement.
Oh, and by the way, Caryn, the people that are writing don't have the education. They don't have history. They don't have literature. They may know how to write in the formula that they're being taught to write, but they're lacking so much.
You need context. You do. You absolutely.
Right, to actually understand who the players are.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't sell Ozempic.
Yeah, this is a problem. This is a problem because the business is killing the business, essentially. That's where it's at. And even for people, for instance, one of the things I have been doing since my departure from newspapering, for a while I was writing freelance stories for a software development magazine. Now, you might ask, wow, what do you know about software development? And I might answer, squat. I know nothing about software development. So basically, this is marketing via cookies and all kinds of the changes that are going on right now with the way things are sold, how we're tracked. I had to go study it up on it in order to sound intelligent in an interview and ask questions of these people who are going to use jargon with me, and I have to know what the jargon means. What I'm saying is that no, a journalist should not be expected to be conversant in absolutely everything. If you're covering politics, you eventually learn about politics. If you're covering science, you should have a background. But you know from your experience as someone familiar with history, you know how to dig, and that's really the key skill.
Well, you always got your papers back if you didn't.
Yes.
If you were making assertions that weren't supported by the facts, Not the facts made up, but by primary source documents. You were lambasted
Oh, yeah.
in a kind way, maybe, or even in front of your peers at a seminar. So you were very careful to make sure that what you were writing and the assertions you were making had some facts behind them.
Oh, absolutely. A good journalist, a good writer, a good researcher, if nothing else, knows how to dig. And you have that skill. You know what that's worth. I was shocked, but not too shocked when about a dozen or so years ago, I did go back to college. I thought I would get a degree and become a dietitian because I could see where newspapers were going, and I just felt I could make a difference, particularly for the geriatric population, who are not fed very well in certain congregate care, and I thought I would study that, and I loved it. I ultimately didn't get the degree because I couldn't keep up with the requirement of doing an internship for a year unpaid. Grown-ups can't do that. So I did drop out. But I will say this, my classmates, who were many years my junior, we were all taken to the campus library to learn how to use the library, which, oh boy. This was an eye-opener. The librarian asked how many people consider Wikipedia a reliable resource. And, you talk about people citing their sources and I would say, yeah, 3/4 of the hands went up. This is an issue. There's no more critical thinking anymore. People absorb and accept without thinking critically. There are ways, and Newsline does try to do this. Newsline will present facts, will present a story without an agenda, without anybody's agenda, and let the listener come to their own conclusion based on what they hear. And we try to use the original source if we can reach them. If not, we quote the secondary source, saying the secondary source quoted the primary source. We don't do it quite that awkwardly, but we try to let people know we've made an effort to reach people. We do the best we can. It's an honest effort, nothing more than that. And I think to some degree it's not that people are getting lazy. I think people are under a lot of pressure to produce more and to attract the money, attract the support, attract the advertisers, attract the readers. And so you have to pump it up. We were told that at the newspaper. Oh, the lead on that story is really kind of dull. Let's pump it up. Let's get the reader into it.
Do you think that when you went to the library with that class, that for many of those people, it might have been the first time they'd ever been in a research library?
Yes, absolutely.
I was afraid you were going to say that. We're probably pretty close to the same age, and we grew up at a time when perhaps our mother, usually, took us to the library once or twice a week because she had to keep up with her books, and so it gave us time to browse. And so I think I grew up in the libraries, and that's why my choice of campus was based on how big the library was.
Yes.
And that was the internet. That was the internet in those days, because if you wanted information, that's where you...
Yeah, but it was a reliable internet. Well, first of all, you couldn't pick up anything more serious than a head cold in the library. Now you can get a virus on your computer by going on the internet. But also, the other thing is the great frustration with libraries is there's never time to read every book. And there's so much wisdom in there. There's so much. Think about all the great minds that have ever existed are under one roof, and that always fascinated me. The great thinking of the world, the story of our civilization under one roof. And if you ever want to read, just for fun, a beautifully written book that is also in some ways a little tragic, it's called The Library Book. And it's a history of of a library that suffered a terrible fire, a library in California that I believe turned.
Who's the author?
My goodness, this was a book I got as a gift. I should know. You know what? I cannot find.
You could find it and send it to me, and I'll put it as a reference in here.
Eric, I did find it. Susan Orlean. Susan Orlean is the author, Orlean, and it's about the catastrophic fire that struck the Los Angeles Central Library. She does an amazing job because it's not just about the library. You have to read the book to understand, but she goes very deep, and she has a beautiful, elegant writing style. I think you'll enjoy it.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. For the listeners who are saying, this isn't a podcast about amateur radio, one of the reasons that we're kind of on this track, Caryn gave an amazing interview for Ham Radio Workbench podcast by the time this comes out about a month or two ago. All of the ham radio discussion was mostly there, and it was very complete from what I listened to. So this is kind of why at the beginning of our conversation we decided that we would go kind of off in a different direction. And I'm loving the direction that we're going in, and I hope that the listeners are as well. So, now that we're talking about Amateur Radio Newsline, was there a story that you felt was like the most important story so far that you've covered on Newsline? And can you mention what that is?
Oh boy, the most important story.
I mean, can you classify stories like that?
Don't know. I can classify them by category, I think, Eric, because in 8 or 9, going on 9 years of doing this, well, yes, I will say Bill Pasternak's death was a big one. Bill Pasternak being a co-founder of Amateur Radio Newsline, and the reason I ended up being part of Newsline. With his passing, I mean, the man was a giant, and when he died, the newscast shut down for many weeks, and everybody wondered what was going to happen. And I had just been brought on board, presumably to assist him because he was in bad health. So I think the most important story from a personal viewpoint is Bill Pasternak's death. It changed everything for everybody involved in Newsline and for anybody who knew Bill. And a lot of people apparently really knew Bill and loved, I'm sorry I never got to know him. 2 New Yorkers who never met,
Although Bill was in Los Angeles for many years, and I think George mentioned it as well, but any of us that grew up there remembered when he started Westlink, where he was playing the news out over the repeaters.
That's right.
In Los Angeles. And then apparently, I guess he was duplicating his efforts on cassette tapes.
Yes.
And sending those all over the place so that those could be played almost nationwide. So, interesting thing, I had read that the Iranian Revolution, where the Shah of Iran was deposed during the Carter administration, apparently the Ayatollah Khomeini in Paris had actually did the same thing, and that all of his speeches were sent into Iran on cassette tapes.
Wow.
So it would be pre-internet,
Mhm.
and people were duplicating tapes, and they would take a duplicated tape, make duplicates, and maybe by the time you got your tape, it was unintelligible, but still intelligible.
Yeah.
It was an amazing thing, and that's what I do remember about him. I was about to interview Bill before he passed away, and there's a few people like that that I've missed that opportunity, but I had looked so forward to interviewing Bill. So that was something that was very personal to you. Even though you hadn't met him, you potentially were kind of following in the footsteps of an organization that he had created over 30 years, 40 years?
Yeah, it was difficult for me because first of all, I was a ham maybe a year and very new to something I was still having to learn a lot about. And here I was being told, okay, we need a newscast. It's like, yeah, but I just got here, folks. I just got here. I just got on the air. What do I do? You know, and we did our best for a couple of weeks. We have a great team, so we were able to pull it off because everybody worked together to salvage it. I hear about him constantly, and I really enjoy that because it's my only way I'll ever get to know him. What I like, Eric, is that I'm seeing in your shack there your license plates hanging on your wall, which I remarked about earlier. And I have on the wall in my shack a license plate, actually the same. Of course, it's a California license plate. It would be the same color, and it says WA6 ITF. It's a very weathered license plate, a little banged up, mounted on a block of wood. It looks beautiful. I had it put on a block of wood. It's hanging on the wall. This was sent in the mail to me about 2 or 3 years ago, quite unexpectedly, with a familiar return address from Picayune, Mississippi, that being Don Wilbanks, AE5DW. He has the other license plate.
It depends. Do you have stickers on your license plate, or do you have no stickers on your license plate?
No stickers. No stickers.
So that was the front license plate.
Yeah, yeah. Bill Pasternak's license plate. Don had both.
Black and yellow or blue and yellow?
Oh no, it's blue and yellow, like yours, like yours. And Don, yeah.
Because the plates 10 years before were black and yellow.
Ah, okay. That's a lot like New York had that too. I think New York. Mhm.
You could tell the age of the plates. That would have been really something. Look, it is really something that you guys have his license plates, but
Yeah, yeah. When I called Don, I actually got very choked up, and he said, "No, this belongs to you. This belongs to you now." You know, and he has one in his shack, and he said this was on Bill's truck. This was his license plate. He said he says it needs to be with you in New York now.
probably some bugs still on it, right, when you got it?
Oh yeah, I scraped them off. I mean, that's, scrape them off and just put them in the garbage, send them back to the earth.
The rear plates have the stickers in the upper corners, and the front plates had the bugs.
Yeah, well, of course. The bugs, well, he knows I'm an animal lover. I've got the horse, I feed the squirrels, I got the prairie dogs, and of course our little dogs that we've had here. Yep, so bugs are a welcome, dead ones especially.
Do you have a story that you would think has been maybe the most interesting story that you've covered on Amateur Radio Newsline? Maybe one that required more research, but the gold that came out of the digging was well worth it?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I don't know whether it would be something in technology. I tend to favor the stories that um, really show human connection. Um, the lost QSL card that comes around, uniting three generations. or the Hams. We have a very active group that we cover every now and again in India, where they reunite missing members of the family, which unfortunately happens a lot in India. People go missing. We had this same group. This story did fascinate me. This is the West Bengal Radio Club. They were able to intercept an effort to sell one woman into a human trafficking ring, and they actually were able to locate her using amateur radio and hams in the area.
Really? How interesting.
Yeah, and this is, I think, about a year ago, and they were able to alert the police who got her out of the house and got the individuals who were holding her. She had been tricked into going with some presumed friends who had lured her for a price, and she was going to be sold. And she was transported by train to the next town over.
This is in India.
This is in India. This club goes above and beyond. This club is a bunch of hams who also sometimes function as a social service agency. They do a lot of intervention and a lot of family reunions. They're well connected throughout India, actually throughout a lot of Southeast Asia. They're amazing what they do on a shoestring budget. And I think what I like about our coverage of this group is that it shows the potential of amateur radio. Yes, you can communicate over the internet, you can communicate over WhatsApp, you can communicate over any of these social platforms. You can use Zoom, you can still pick up the telephone too. I mean, that's still there. Radio is part of nature. Radio existed before we were on this planet. Radio will be here after we are gone. By using the powers of this medium, the strengths, we're able to do incredible things like talk to one another, like rescue people, like find folks who are missing, make connections during earthquakes, during wars, during storms, all because of radio. The internet is fragile. The internet is vulnerable. I mean, yeah, radio, okay, we have sunspots. We have our issues. A lot of us are cursing Cycle 25 right now. It hasn't been very well behaved on some days. But radio is there. It will always be there. I think the fact that people can accomplish things person to person via radio is miraculous. It's why I love radio. I never went into TV. After briefly thinking that's where I wanted to work, because radio tickles the imagination. I don't know if you're familiar with Stan Freberg.
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely.
Okay, then you know the spot he did for the old Radio Advertising Bureau, where he was trying to sell the attraction of radio and basically describe the giant ice cream sundae that he had created with the helicopter flying overhead and dropping the cherry on it and the whipped cream and everything. He's trying to convince advertisers that radio has more power in the images it can create in doing that. And that has always stayed with me. That's a classic. The theater of the mind is also the theater of the best and most efficient communication. And I think as hams, we tap into that.
As a kid, I enjoyed radio much more than I enjoyed television.
Mm-hmm.
Probably for that same reason. And just I enjoy reading the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Your brain has to conjure up the images that are being described.
Exactly. The movie that everybody is talking about now, and we wrote about it on Newsline, is the Netflix miniseries All the Light We Cannot See.
Right, I just saw that. The book's much better.
Thank you. I was just about to say, if you have read the book, you may not want to even finish the series. If you haven't read the book and you're not a reader, the series is fine. I read the book, fell in love with it, and only got through 2 episodes of the series because what's the point? I know what everybody looks like because I read the book. I have the pictures in my head.
It was entertaining if you weren't being a purist. You're right. If you're a purist and you read the book, then you're doing a lot of comparing. My wife said the same thing. I did enjoy the book.
Yeah.
I can say I read it probably 2 years ago, and so therefore I didn't remember all of the details. But I agree with you. There are times when you can't really make a book into a great movie.
Mm-mm. No, no. And movies, I think movies, by virtue of the fact that they must be entertaining and have a box office and a commercial appeal, they're like newspapers. Like we said earlier, they're going to be vulnerable to the market. And there's always going to be an element of even subtle sales pitch in there that will attract people.
I think that the movie industry was always commercial based just because of the cost of creating a movie, whether it was done on a soundstage in the 20s and 30s or whether it was done in Italy or Spain in the 60s. These were very expensive operations, and so therefore they were very commercially based. But I think that newspapers, well, I guess they had to sell advertising.
Mm-hmm.
Subscriptions and advertising was the media, and maybe there was some kind of, like the television news from the 50s through the 70s, maybe. Their broadcast license prevented them from being too commercially influenced.
You have the fairness doctrine, which does not, I don't think that's in play anymore. You basically had to present exactly the same amount of airtime to opposing views. And that does not, in the United States, I don't know what happened to the fairness doctrine, but I remember that was very important. You could not compromise your license by using it as an agent of one side or the other.
I think the United States is the only country in the world now that allows drug advertising.
I love that. May cause death. It's like, okay.
When I visit my father in America, I see these commercials are, 2-3 minutes long, and it seems to drive the whole machine. So it's kind of like we're way off the topic. Let me ask you, what excites you the most about what is happening in amateur radio now?
Okay, I'm going to go for what is most people who know me are going to know exactly what I'm going to say. It's the resurgence in CW. It's the rebirth and the rediscovery of CW. And I know everybody loves digital and everybody's into the next great digital thing. But CW invites you to use your brain. CW requires that you learn. CW requires discipline. And ultimately, if you get to a point where you can use it to communicate with others, and I don't mean a quick exchange, I mean a rag chew, even a rag chew of 15 or 20 minutes. You connect with people. You connect with somebody else who shares your commitment to learning a code, who shares your commitment to communicating a little differently. And I think it's a wonderful thing to watch. You go back to my 12-year-old self learning CW to get my novice. That desire stayed with me over the years. I was given, when I got my license, a gift from one of the club members, an old J38 key, because I walked around saying, yeah, now that I got my license, I'm going to learn CW again, or finish learning CW. And I never did. And every year it was, oh, yeah, I'm going to get around. I'm going to get around to doing that. I'm going to learn CW. And, well, somebody called my bluff. I had to learn CW, and I'm so grateful. And I am seeing It's like two big doors being pushed open, and suddenly I'm standing at the end of this really, really long hallway, and it's lined with people on both sides, and they're all CW ops, and it's like the world. This opens the door to a world of people who are curious enough to want to communicate meaningfully in another way. And the QSOs I've had with people in CW, and some of them are, old-time military guys, and some of them are newer ops. You go to their page on QRZ.com, and they all say the same thing. They say, I don't want just a signal report from you and your QTH. I want to get to know you. And yes, that can be done in sideband, but in code, it's different. It's just people are really into this.
I find that so interesting. I find that so interesting from the standpoint that you would think that CW, that people would just want to exchange rig here is, RST, QTH is. But the rag chewing side, well, that's very interesting. And perhaps there's with all of the electronic connection that we carry in our pockets, that truly is miraculous on the one hand, and with all the social media that everyone uses, which is maybe it's now beyond something new, that there's a lot of people that really want sincere social relationships that are not social media relationships. The thing they're carrying in their pocket is not doing it. It's not making them feel part of a community. It's maybe even making them feel isolated. And so what you're saying is quite interesting, that perhaps even CW, because of its requirement for a little bit more, the gate is a little bit higher, it maybe creates a higher quality community. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think rather than higher quality, I would say a very different community, in that you immediately share a bond of commitment to the code. People don't always care if you're fast or slow, just that you be copyable. The courtesy extended to other ops, for the most part, is tremendous. They will slow down for you. They will critique you if you want. They will have patience. What I have learned from CW, I cannot tell you. Here's what it teaches you. It teaches you to accept your mistakes and learn from them. It teaches you patience with yourself. It teaches you patience with others. You cannot learn CW without messing up big time. Oh, God, we all bust our own call sign. How humiliating, right? Yeah, but laugh at it. It's funny. I mean, it really is. I'm like, yeah. I went out, I did a POTA the other day. I messed up my call sign 5 times. What a dork, And I laugh about it because it's okay. Don't take yourself so seriously that you can't have fun. I mean, we're doing this for fun, presumably. I say to people, you're getting too tightly wrapped. You're not having fun. You got to have fun or turn off the rig. This is not a job. We've all had jobs. This is amateur radio. And I think CW puts the fun back into it. For those of us who are, like myself, recovering perfectionists, this is a wonderful, wonderful way to ease up on yourself, to learn something new, to communicate with people who shared the same struggle, who understand it, who appreciate you simply for showing up. CW ops are out there looking for a rag chew and will have patience with you and learn about you. And The follow-up emails are outstanding. By the time you get a follow-up email to your rag Jew, you guys are already old friends. You know people. It's easier to, I mean, yes, I do sideband. I check into nets. I belong to a couple of nets. So I haven't given up on sideband, and I won't say, oh yeah, I tucked my microphone away and I'm never going to use it again, because I love using sideband. But there is a quality to CW op that it's a secret handshake. There you go. It's the secret handshake. It's like, you're one of us. Okay, let's have a QSO. And it's magic.
What would your advice then be to new or returning hams?
If you don't think you can do CW, try it anyway, because you may surprise yourself. If you don't like it, at least you tried it, but don't close the door. Because if I'm perfectly honest, I will say this to you. When I walked around saying, oh, yeah, I started to learn CW when I was 12, and now I'm going to learn it again. Okay, brutal honesty here. I said that half-heartedly. I did not have a burning desire. I just said it because it sounded good. I mean, maybe I would do it, but maybe I wouldn't. But maybe I would. But maybe I wouldn't. Okay. But then I got the J38 as a gift. And I've said this a number of times. Then a year or two later, my brother sent me a beautiful Vibraplex key. And I was just doing, signal reports and QTH basically, the quickie. And I said, my God, I've been given gifts. And you don't let gifts gather dust. You use them. Gifts are given for a reason. Celebrate the fact that you have this and put it to good use. It's important. Respect it. And so my journey began. And wow, this is the best. I've never enjoyed ham radio so much as now. Okay, Eric, I'm coming on my 10th year. I got back into it late, after my life, my horseback riding, all of that. 10 years in 2024. These last couple of years doing CW have been explosive. It's been wonderful. New hams, try it. Please try CW. It'll tickle your brain. It'll make you feel good. And if you're a returning ham or a ham who's been curious about it but not curious enough about it, get a little more curious. Try it. It won't bite you. It won't bite you, I promise.
And the resources for learning CW now are light years ahead of where they were in the olden days.
Right. You don't have to join the Navy. Right.
Right. You have the Long Island CW Club and you have CW Ops. Both of their learning systems are like unbelievably good.
I have also connected, and I came into this through LICW. I've made amazing friends. In fact, LICW, I bless them 1,000 times. They were my gateway to doing POTA. And I've made some outstanding friendships. These people are like family to me. My greatest progress has been made with CW Innovations. These are just amazing friends. We are a tight group of I've become a coach with them now. And what this does is it takes people who already know CW and gets you on a more proficient level. It was only with them that I have learned, oh my God, how can this be? I'm doing head copy. How did that happen? How do people do that? And I'm doing it. And I'm rag chewing. Okay, I may not have racing stripes on my key, but who cares? I'm getting the message through. I'm having fun. That's okay. This is not a race. We are communicating, people. We're communicating. That's why we're on the radio. And CW Innovations taught me that. And best of all, and this is the biggie for me, I made peace with the fact that, yes, indeed, you can make mistakes and survive. That's a big one. That's a real big one because people are afraid.
Yes, that's true. Because people are afraid of looking foolish in front of other people.
Yes.
So you're kind of telling them that it's okay. Everybody's been there.
Oh, absolutely. And we're all fine with that. And we all smile. Nobody laughs at you. I went back to horseback riding as an adult, and I have the most wonderful horse in the world. He's a unicorn, actually. But the friend that I ride with or have ridden with in the past, he got into riding in his, I want to say 40s or 50s. And he's a guy, so an older man in riding breeches is kind of unusual, especially he's a electrical contractor, so he's a tradesman. So, strutting around in your breeches is bound to attract attention. But he said to me, and he's a very wise man, he said to me, it's really hard to learn to ride when you're a grown-up. And this is true of anything. Substitute whatever it is, ham radio, CW, but I'll say riding because I'm quoting my friend. He says, you have to be willing to look stupid in front of other people. You have to be willing to fail in front of other people. You have to be willing to make mistakes in front of other people. And as grown-ups, we don't like that because we figure by now we should know everything. And he's right. Yeah, right.
Yes, that's very true. Caryn, this has been, for me, over the top. I knew that we would have to go in a different direction because Ham Radio Workbench did it so well with you when they interviewed you last. So I hope that the people will go to do both, and I'll put the link in to the show notes for the episode of the Ham Radio Workbench where you were at, so that they'll listen to that and they'll listen to this, and then they'll know Caryn Eve Murray, KD2GUT, much better than they did before. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thank you, Eric. 73 for now.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Caryn. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KD2GUT in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.